This is my Tailout Sculpin. While I'm often tempted to fish a huge fly in hopes of catching a huge fish, with low and clear water, I usually think smaller is probably better. At about 3.5 inches and with a pretty wide, bulky profile, this fly is a pretty good match for the sculpin that I see in my local waters. Because of the way sculpin behave, I want to fish this fly pretty much right on the bottom, so tying it hook point up is imperative. Tied in a pair of dumbbell eyes on the bottom of the hook, or what will be the bottom of the hook, top of the hook shank. Tying in a little bit of olive and copper flash here to the hook shank, taking my thread all the way back. I couldn't find any copper wire, so I'm using a little bit of copper crystal flash here. Tying it into the hook shank and securing it with my tying thread. For dubbing, I'm using Senyo's laser dub in Sculpin Olive. Start at the very beginning of the hook bend and work your way forward about halfway toward the eyes. Then you can take your wire, hopefully you're using wire, or in this case your crystal flash, and bind that dubbing down. For what comes next, it's helpful to have a little bit of dubbing on your hook shank. However, this is all going to be covered up, so I'm just going to use the thread to bind it down. At this point, it's pretty helpful to use a whip finisher or a half hitch and take your thread off of the hook. Remove your hook from the vise, take your rabbit strip tail, measuring the distance that you want it to protrude from the back of the hook, and pierce the rabbit strip with the hook point. Now that you've done that, you can re-secure your hook in the tying vise and start your thread up again right behind the eyes. Secure your tail to the hook shank, and if you want to, you can try to snip off a little bit of that excess leather. You could try and use one very long piece of rabbit to do these next two steps, but I find it helpful to just use a second piece. While they do make cross-cut rabbit strips that are designed for this, I find that using a regular zonker strip helps to create a pretty wide and bulky profile, which is what I want for my sculpins. Take a few wraps with your rabbit strip, and then taking care to not bind the fibers down with your tying thread, secure it in. Take 3 strands of your favorite rubber leg material and tie them in on either side of the hook. I find it helpful to wrap it underneath the front of the hook shank up near the eye, just to really make those legs pop out the way I want them to. Because sculpin have prominent pectoral fins that are pretty short, I'm going to cut these rubber legs relatively short. At this point, I'm going to add just one piece of that copper crystal flash going down either side of the fly. I'm leaving it pretty long on the back side for now, but that'll all get trimmed up later. To build the head of this fly, I'm going to use some olive wool. Taking about a 2-inch long piece, folding it over your tying thread, and start tying it in behind the eyes. I usually start on what is the bottom and work my way to the top. As you tie these in, make sure to pull the fibers back to bind it in with your tying thread. Your next 2 wraps will be going over the eyes, just as you would to figure 8 them in when you tie them to the hook shank. One piece of wool on the bottom and another on the top. For your last 2 pieces of wool, you can be a little bit more generous because we want this to be very densely packed and build some bulk to push some water. Once you've finished adding all your wool, pull the wool back tight and take a few thread wraps right in front of the eye to really bind that wool back. Carefully, you can make a few turns with your whip finisher, trying to not pick up any of that wool fiber, as I've somewhat successfully done here. And now this thing needs a haircut. Keeping in mind that this will ride hook point up, we want to make sure that the head that is near the hook point is actually a little bit more trimmed up than the other side. But with that being said, we also want the bottom of the hook to ride flush to the bottom, so a generous haircut on either side of the hook is probably a good idea. You can also use a brush if you want to pull out some of those fibers, but with the amount of wool that I've used here, it's going to be pretty densely packed. Once you've trimmed up your wool head, you can trim off any fibers, flash, anything that you've left long, and just really take your time and trim that thing up as much or as little as you want. You can use some UV clear cure head cement, or in this case, Loctite super glue to finish off your fly. You can tie this fly in a variety of colors. I'm pretty partial to this tan natural colorway, but olive is great as well. The only thing that I would say about color here is that you want to make sure that that head of that fly is darker than your body to add some contrast. That's it. Tailout Sculpin. Go fishing.